Welcome to another episode of Foolproof Theology. My name is Chase Davis, and I'm your host. It's great to be with you here again today. I'm recording at home, left my mic at the office, so we got AirPods today on the show. But I'm excited to bring a guest on who I've read his book, Defenders of the West, Raymond Ibrahim. He's a senior fellow with several think tanks. He's an author, published multiple books, Sword and Scimitar, and I'll put a link to these in the show notes for you listeners. But Raymond, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
That's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So I was reading this book alongside some of my elders in my church and some other friends on the internet, and as we were enjoying the work, Defenders of the West, very inspirational work for Christians today. One of the questions that kept coming up are like, this guy's an author and writer, and it looks like he's pretty stacked and he lifts. And so I wanted to know, do you have a lifting routine? What does it look like for you being an author and writer in your health and fitness?
Right. Yeah. Most of what you're seeing is residual because many decades ago, in my early 20s, I was actually a competitive bodybuilder. And I was very much into weightlifting. And before that, I was a football player, and I went into bodybuilding because I hurt I had an ACL reconstruction. I couldn't continue football, and I liked lifting weights, and I wanted something competitive, so it became bodybuilding, though I didn't really care for it. Won the Mr. Los Angeles teenage division, I think 1991 or 92, something like that. But now I still do work out, but I have several injuries, so I kind of like try to, at most if I can get 2 days a week, that's pretty good. I think it's important for people who are cerebral and intellectual to also maintain some sort of physical regimen, and I'm trying to stick with it. But it's, I guess, easier for me because I've been doing it for so long. It's old hat for me. So I'm glad people are noticing. That's nice. It's a good
That's great.
compliment.
Yeah, I feel the same way with 3 kids and all the stuff we got going on. Like 2 days a week is like the kind of the standard, but if I can get in 4 or 5, that's better. When you were bodybuilding, was there in bodybuilding competitions when you won Mr. Los Angeles or whatever it was, do you compete on a variety of lifts, or is it just one that you're competing on?
Well, no, bodybuilding is just standing in your Speedos and flexing, which is why I didn't really stick with it, and why I just stuck with it into my teens, and that was about it. But I did lift weights, and I was more interested in things like powerlifting and strength lifting, just because, I don't know, it's more manly, I suppose. But I had good lifts. I think I benched 450 one time max.
Nice.
And then I tore my pectoral muscle. And then I tore my tricep later on. So that's why I decided to just go the route of the pen and the book, before I tore everything apart. Yeah.
That's great. Awesome. Well, this book that you've written, Defenders of the West, just came out recently, and everybody's talking about it. I picked it up, listened to it on audiobook, and man, I listened to it. I had to skip some parts, to be honest, with my kids because I was listening to it with my 2 sons in the car. And what these Muslims would do, was very atrocious, and maybe we'll get into that in the episode. But I guess my question is, there's a lot of confusion about the Crusades, the Crusaders. It's kind of like one of those things in American public education, which is very frowned upon. People are uncertain about. You ask people about it, and they're like, well, it's bloody, and it's confusing, and it might have been a mistake. And so what do you think most people today misunderstand about the Crusades and Crusaders?
Well, the misunderstanding, it was bloody, it was violent, it was atrocious, et cetera, et cetera. But what's missing is the background and the context of what started the Crusades. The problem is, whenever you talk about the historical conflict between Muslims and Christians, it invariably, if it's a Western audience, it invariably begins with the Crusades in 1095. That's when the first Crusade is called. The problem with that is you don't know what's been going on for 4 centuries before the first Crusade and what led to that dramatic call, which is basically a non-stop jihad on the Christian world. Soon after the death of the Muslim prophet Muhammad, the traditional date being 632 AD, the jihad blew out of Arabia and began just conquering what was near it, which was primarily the Christian world, what we call the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, and they conquered Jerusalem in 637, all of Greater Syria, which encompassed the modern states of Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, etc., was conquered, and then Egypt by 641 was conquered. And before the end of the 7th century, they had conquered all the way up to Morocco. And keep in mind, those nations, when we think of them today, Morocco, Egypt, Syria, we think of them as Islamic nations because they are. but at that time they were more Christian than Europe was. That was the heart of the Christian world, the East. That's why the Constantine moved the capital from Rome to Constantinople in essentially what would be Turkey today, Asia Minor. So you had this violent, savage, brutal jihad that went on for over a century until 732, 1 century after the death of Muhammad. The Muslims were in the heart of France, and that's where you have the Battle of Tours, where they're stopped. But of course, they're holed up in Spain, and the Mediterranean is awash with more Islamic jihads and conquests of all those islands. Rome itself was sacked in 846 AD, and very few people know this, from Muslim raiders, also operating under this mentality. So that's the background, and 3/4 of what was once the Christian world, the older, more advanced, most of our, when you think of the church fathers, they come from the East, whether it's Augustine from North Africa, or all the Athanasiuses and Anthony's and so forth from Egypt. This was the heart of the Christian world. That was severed, permanently conquered, and so forth. And then now you fast forward to the 11th century, and now you have the Seljuk Turks are the new standard bearers of Islam, as opposed to their forebears, who would have been the Arabs and the Moors, as they were called in Spain, and so forth. But now they're even more jihadist and more savage and brutal. And right around 1071, there's a major Battle of Manzikert against Eastern Roman Empire, where the Turks prevail. They obliterate the army. And now Asia Minor, which was one of the oldest Christian regions as well, most of St. Paul's letters that we have in the New Testament are churches there. Now it's conquered, and according to the primary sources, you have tens of thousands of Christians who are just being slaughtered, others, women and children, being enslaved, thousands of churches being burned, desecrated, and so forth. And this is now the backdrop. This is what Pope Urban II in 1095 cites when he calls for the First Crusade. This is why the First Crusaders were so angry. And the same atrocities were happening to Western European pilgrims who were going to the Holy Land. The Turks and other Muslim groups were attacking them, killing them, raping them, enslaving them. So something had to be done, and the First Crusade was called. And so I think that's the problem. Very few people understand that background. They just know that, we have actual historians, or so-called historians, such as John Esposito of Georgetown University, which I attended for a while. And in one of his books, I'm paraphrasing it, but it's almost verbatim, he says 4 centuries of peace elapsed between the Muslim world and Europe. So all that I just told you, he calls that peaceful. And until some papal power play, mean Catholics decided to just ruin all this peace and send these crusaders, who were, of course, jingoists, chauvinists, racists, and Islamophobes, right? And they're going there to colonize. So that became the dominant narrative until today, mostly. If you read these secondary histories by these pseudo-historians, another one that comes to mind is Karen Armstrong, who's some bestseller and parades herself as a historian, and again completely gets it all wrong, probably intentionally. Okay, so yeah, the Crusades were violent and they were brutal, but you have to understand that they fit into just war theory. This was Christian territory that was conquered when the Muslims took over Jerusalem in 637. It had been Christian for many centuries. Okay, and all that area, as I told you, Egypt and Syria and so forth. And the Crusaders and the Latins understood this, the Franks. So we are helping the Christians in that region, the Armenians, the Greeks, the Eastern Empire, Roman Empire, and we're liberating land that was Christian. So it was 100% a just war, and that's what they engaged in. But unfortunately, all of that has been left out amongst the history. It's a great vacuum, and it just starts with the Crusades as if everything before that was hunky-dory.
Yeah, right. One of the things that I'm curious to know more about you would be, you've written this book, you've written Sword and Scimitar. What kind of sparked your interest in revisiting these historical figures and the kind of Crusades as a time in history?
Well, based on my own ethnic background, my family are Coptic Christians from Egypt, which is the most indigenous inhabitants of Egypt, who were Christian again, and are now, of course, went from a majority to a tiny minority. So my family came here. I was born here, but I obviously had an interest a personal interest in the nexus between Islam and Christianity, being a Christian from the Muslim world. And also in college, I studied and gravitated towards this. So actually, my master's thesis in history, which was under Victor Davis Hanson, he was my professor at the time. We're going back about 25 years. Was actually about a first battle between Muslims and Christians based on Greek and Arabic sources, the Battle of Yarmouk in 636. So both professionally and personally, I've had an interest. And then I went to colleges. I was working towards a PhD, first in Georgetown University, then I went to Catholic University. I was in Washington at the time, working full time at the Library of Congress, and I just couldn't maintain my load because I also had a book deal at the same time. So yeah, but now I'm still in the field, still writing happily especially about the historical conflict, but of course about what's happening in the modern era, which is even more relevant.
Yeah, agreed. With this book, particularly Defenders of the West, you've obviously got some very lots of characters I haven't even heard of. I mean, I went to seminary twice, and this is rarely talked about. I think we read one book on the Crusades by Rodney Stark, but we don't hear about these people. I mean, you pulled it into modern times with St. Louis, which was very helpful, but we don't hear about them. We don't talk about them. I just found them very fascinating. I'm curious to know from you, though, was there one of these eight figures that you kind of trace in Defenders of the West that stood out to you as kind of like, this was my favorite guy to look into, or I had a different conception before I studied him? Which one stood out to you and why?
Well, first, a word about the selection process, because there's some confusions about that. I discussed it in the introduction, why I selected who I selected, and to one extent, it was because I didn't want to repeat myself. The book before this book, Defenders of the West, the book before Sword and Scimitar, 14 Centuries of War Between Islam and the West, I talked also a lot about various Christian heroes in connection to the major battles that I was discussing. So I left them out, even though they could have come into this book as well, because it would have been sort of a repeat for people who read the first book, and I wanted to just focus on new characters, new epochs, new events and incidents as much as I could. As far as any one particular one of these heroes resonating with me, yeah, I suppose I like Godfrey of Beyond, the very first chapter one. Really, all of them. I mean, that's in the end, I picked them all because I like them, but in various ways. I like Vlad the Impaler because I think his story is just so different than what we know. He's the most famous, if not infamous, but in a completely different way that has nothing to do with his actual character. So in a way, I sought to rehabilitate his image based on primary sources, not a novel. The idea of Dracula comes from a novel written in the late 1800s by Bram Stoker. But I really like them all, and it's hard to pick because they all have the same characteristics, which I find fascinating, and it's a fusion that's missing today, which is extreme serious piety and extreme ferocity in battle. Okay,
Yeah.
these men these men had no confusion. They didn't think that to be a pious Christian meant to be a doormat, okay, or to turn the other cheek, or as I often say, they didn't make a virtue out of a vice, cowardice, and
Right.
say, oh, it's because I'm a good Christian that I'm not going to fight. So they threw themselves into the thick of the fray. A lot of them were emperors and kings and nobles who had everything to lose and had everything to live for. They sacrificed it. Most of them died very early in life. They could have lived on. So yeah, I can't really. I put them all together. Yeah, they're all in the same book. So I like them all for the same reason. I probably said Godfrey because I was thinking chapter one, the first guy. So definitely, but I definitely like him. But I can't really say that I like him or respect him any more than the others because they all are the same in many ways.
Yeah, the story of Skanderbeg, I think that's how you say his name, Skanderbeg, right?
Well, yeah, that was
He's
a title given
fascinating.
to him.
Oh, right, that's right. Yeah, because he was actually a Muslim
George
general,
Castroti, yeah,
and then came back to his country, right?
Yeah, he was an Albanian noble, and he was seized. The Muslims, the Ottomans especially, had a practice of seizing young Christian nobles and Islamizing them and essentially doctrinating them in Islam and making them into jihadists. And then they became the crack troops of the Ottoman Empire, the most feared. And then they would unloose them back on the Christian population to drain them, conquer them, and take more young children. It was kind of a vicious cycle, obviously, to drain the Christian populations under Ottoman control of their best and brightest and strongest, and at the same time through numbers by taking them, and then empowering the Ottoman ranks themselves. So it's pretty diabolical. But that's what happened to Skanderbeg, whose real name is George Castriotti. Skanderbeg was the title. He was seized as a youth, forced into Islam, actually rose to the top of the Ottoman military hierarchy and became a leading general. And so Skanderbeg is how the Turks called him. They call it Skander means in Arabic and Turkish it's Alexander, and so they likened him to Alexander the Great because
Gotcha.
Albania is close enough to the Greeks. So Skanderbeg means Lord Alexander. So they respected him, liked it. But when he had a chance, he broke free from Ottoman ranks and ran back to impoverished Albania and took his place as its rightful leader. And then the Ottomans just waged jihad after jihad for a quarter of a century. And he lived basically in caves and waged guerrilla warfare. He's sort of known as the Albanian Braveheart, the counterpart to William Wallace. I don't want to give too much away. I know his story is very fascinating, but he defeated them in every battle and until old age and wounds of 25 years finally took him. But
Yeah.
he's just one example of what these men did and what they went through just to keep the hordes at bay.
Yeah, one of the fascinating things, whether it's a character like him, a figure like him, is that oftentimes when we look to the past, it seems to me we approach the piety of those in the past with a very modern lens. And furthermore, kind of secular authors will disparage any kind of piety, and they'll just talk about power hungry, or they really don't assess them on their own terms. And one thing I appreciated in the book that you did was kind of how you dove into, like, were these people motivated by zeal for the Lord, or were they motivated by other things? You see this even in the American story with figures like George Washington, who was an Anglican, and everybody wants to downplay his piety. And we could assess that historically, we could do all that, but people just assume people in the past were less pious or something. And so, when you're looking at these authors, how are you kind of giving a fair reading to their motivations? Because I think our modern assessment of piety can sometimes be a bit off.
Oh, absolutely. That's a good question. Well, the way to assess it, if you want to be objective, is you have to look at the primary sources, what's written about them by the earliest sources, the quotes that are attributed to them. And that's when you do history, that's all we have. Whether one doesn't trust those sources or not, but there's no reason not to trust them. But then when it comes to certain men, when it comes to the Crusaders, what did they have to gain? As I mentioned, a lot of these men had a great life and they had everything to live for. So what was to be gained by sacrificing everything, selling their possessions to raise armies, and then traveling and suffering for thousands of miles, suffering from famine and plague, and of course, nonstop arrows from their Islamic enemies. So what was to be gained by that if it wasn't what they said, which was they were doing this for Christianity's sake? And so obviously that makes perfect sense. But you're right that today people love to, what they do essentially is they project themselves onto the past. They're atheists, they're not serious, or if they are nominal Christians, they're not serious about it, they certainly won't inconvenience themselves. So when they look at the past, they can't believe that someone actually would. And therefore it must be some other agenda that they had, something that they would do, the moderns who are projecting this. I believe that's one of the main issues at hand.
Yeah, with Islam particularly, as you kind of spell out in your book, the atrocities they committed against Christians, raping, pillaging, capturing, enslaving, all this kind of stuff. Today, many people have been kind of duped into thinking, the common slogan, Islam is a religion of peace. And I think you highlighted in the conclusion, somebody that was talking to Angela Merkel in Germany, talking about it's good that Berlin will be a Muslim majority city. But I'm curious, when you looked at the primary sources, when you're looking at Islam, how are we to assess Islam? Are these men that are deviating from Muhammad's writings? Are they living out his writings? How are we to understand Islam and this notion that it's a religion of peace?
Well, sadly, if you want to be, again, objective and fair and neutral and approach this from a scholarly point of view, what is Islam? What is its teaching, et cetera, et cetera? The things that groups like ISIS, Islamic State did, the disgusting, horrendous atrocities of beheading Christians because they won't recant their faith, and enslaving women, Yazidis and Christians and others, and putting them in cages, and enforcing jizya taxes on other populations, minorities that they had subjugated. All of that is doctrinally Islamic and manifested itself all throughout Islamic history. So the groups that I discuss in the book, these are the sultanates and the caliphates. These weren't just some tiny little group. Today they'll say, ISIS or Al Qaeda. These are terror groups that don't represent the greater, Muslim mass. But in fact, historically, the ones who did represent the Muslim masses, the caliphates and sultanates, that's exactly how they behaved as well. And they all referenced and quoted the same Quran verses and the same hadiths, the words and deeds of Muhammad from his seerah or biography. So it's all very consistent. So it's very strange now for someone to come up and say, no, actually Islam means a religion of peace. No, it doesn't. It never has. Still doesn't. And those who believe that are either lying or have been lied to. It's very straightforward. There's no doubt about that. Anyone who bothers to look at the original Islamic sources, especially in their original language, which obviously lots of Americans can't do that. And I'll tell you, a lot of Qurans that are out there that are translated take some liberties to whitewash what's being presented as opposed to what's actually in the Arabic.
Right. With kind of bringing it into our modern context, I was a missionary, both a visiting missionary and a missionary over in some Muslim context, and it was fascinating to hear from firsthand accounts of Muslims how they perceived America, Western civilization, and particularly our involvement in places like Afghanistan, Iraq, all this kind of stuff, because Muslims kind of have no qualms, at least over there, about calling it a type of crusade that America is on to fight Islam. But Americans are very not into that, very opposed to that idea, always trying to apologize for any kind of sentiment that would even insinuate that. We're here to spread democracy is kind of the lore that we're here to do. We're here to free people and that kind of thing. And so how are we to reconcile what seems like historically local Muslim populations and even atrocities committed today, like in Nigeria, where you've got, 60,000 people in the last Christians killed in the last 10 years. You've got over Christmas, 100 Christians were brutally murdered by Islamic jihadists in Nigeria. How are we to conceive of this like wildly different assessment of the American project, what America is trying to do, and the Muslim understanding of what America is trying to do?
Well, I mean, what America is trying to do, I mean, that's, first of all, I wouldn't even put it that way because it's not Americans, it's the leadership class, which are probably not even really Americans at heart, to put it that way. So they have their own agendas, obviously, and they use the humanitarian, argument. So, the Ukraine war, well, the Americans were propelled into wanting to support it because of all the atrocities that Russia is supposedly engaged in. And I say supposedly because I haven't really followed it. It's not my field. I'm not saying it is or isn't. I don't know, really. But I don't trust the media, that's for sure. So if they say something, doesn't necessarily mean I believe it, obviously. But at the same time, as you mentioned, you have in Nigeria where 60,000 Christians have been slaughtered and massacred, often with machetes, burned alive, really heinous stuff. And we don't hear anything about it. And when it does come up, the same American leaders who are wanting war in other places downplay it and tell you, no, this is actually a product of climate change.
Sure.
So one definite lesson is don't ever buy into when any American leader tells you that we're doing this for humanitarian sake, because they don't care, obviously.
Right.
Oftentimes, in fact, it was 100% U.S. policy in the Middle East that created ISIS and the so-called migrant crisis and the slaughter of Christians and non-Muslim minorities throughout the Middle East during the so-called, as they tried to present it, as an Arab Spring. I believe around 2013 it began or so forth. But that's not what it was, obviously. So, but I think you're also asking me how Muslims understand this. To Muslims, they have a much more basic understanding. You're an American, you're a Jew, you're my enemy, because that's what the Quran says. And it's a very tribalistic worldview. You're the other. Obviously, whatever you're doing, it's negative to me. So that's how it's always seen, and that's why Americans are called Crusaders, and the Zionist Crusader coalition, as they refer to America and Israel. So there's no way out of that. That's just how it's always seen, whether they're right or wrong. Whether America has negative intentions, or if they're really trying to be altruistic, which is doubtful. That's definitely how the Muslim world. And I say that based on my viewing and watching Muslim Arabic speaking news programs and other various intellectuals speaking about it.
Yeah, so with, Christians are reticent today, and this is kind of the thing that I took away from the book was at the end you kind of talk about reasserting ourselves and having a bigger vision. There's a lot of in evangelical cultures right now. There's a lot of talk about eschatology, postmillennialism, or premillennialism, if you're of that flavor, particularly with events in Israel. But Americans are very, or Christians, particularly evangelical Christians, are very like scared, I would say nervous, squeamish on kind of like we want the world to be more Christian. They don't want to advocate for Christian principles in the public square. They don't want to advocate for Christ being Lord, and yet Muslims seem to have no shame about this. They want world domination. Why do you think that is? Have we just been duped by kind of a modern false piety? Where does that come from?
Well, on the Muslim side, nothing's changed. The Muslims of today are just following in the paths and the footsteps of their ancestors and their culture. They haven't changed. Whether that's good or bad, that's the point. The problem with the West is, it's no longer Christian, and it used to be a Christian civilization, and its mores and ethos were fundamentally tied up to Christianity. And today, it's broken from that. So there's a discontinuity in what we call the West, in Europe, in America, North America, so Australia, et cetera, et cetera. This is why the men in the book, Defenders of the West, are once they were heroes and extolled by posterity. Now if they're not known, then they're demonized and looked as horrible people. They're the epitome of toxic masculinity, patriarchy, racism, chauvinism, misogyny, whatever the case may be. That's how they're now seen. So I think that the bottom line is, and I think a lot of Christians in America need to understand this, is not a Christian nation. In fact, this nation is pretty hostile to Christianity in one form or another. So that's why it's very hard for people of the West to be able to confront and deal with the Islamic threat the way their ancestors did, because their ancestors had a clearer vision, and it was grounded in the gospel, in biblical teaching. No one had any qualms about fighting for the faith. We have to remember, so the problem, I think, is a lot of forces that are fundamentally hostile to Christianity in the West have emphasized and have promoted the idea that to be a true Christian is to be passive, to forgive, to turn the other cheek, to shut up, and be a doormat, essentially. And if you do anything other than that, you're not a real Christian. You're a horrible person. And if that was, that's not how Jesus lived his life. Jesus
Right.
said turn the other cheek, but there's one incident in the Bible where he got slapped and he didn't turn the other cheek. He actually questioned and challenged the man who slapped him why he did that.
Right. Right.
And when the centurion came for a miracle for his servant, and Jesus obliged, and whenever Jesus performed a miracle, the next thing he did is he would tell the recipient, repent. He didn't tell this man who was obviously an open warrior, the centurion who clearly had killed people and was in command of killing people. He didn't tell him, hey, you have to quit the army because you're a murderer. Okay,
Right.
so it's that's why the idea of just war was so inherent to Christian thought. No one had any problems with it. We usually trace it to St. Augustine, but it goes much further. But I think today Christians have been conditioned into thinking that is not Christian, and I think that's because forces that are hostile to Christianity want them to think that, because that's the way you can control Christians. Tell them you do nothing except be a doormat and accept it, and if you do that, you're a good Christian. You're saved. And if you
Yeah.
don't, you're a horrible hypocrite going to hell. So I think that's definitely a big part of it.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Yeah, it's something I wrestle with as a pastor. When I teach those passages, Sermon on the Mount or other things, trying to be very careful not to give in to modern sentiments, trying to be faithful to the scriptures, and also trying to challenge where Christians have been lied to or kind of duped on these matters. Because most modern people that, I'm in a secular context, a very secular context in Boulder, Colorado, and when you teach about history or Christian history or how these things work. One, it's complex. One, you have to tease it out. But two, you have to confront. You have to confront how we've been lied to, how we've been taught being a doormat is kind of the way of Christ. And they don't like to hear that. And they'll call you all sorts of names if you
Mm-hmm.
challenge those things. In Europe, they've got their own kind of thing we've got going on our southern border with kind of what governors are now openly calling an invasion on our southern border. And Europe, they have a migrant crisis in Italy, in England, all this kind of stuff. And so I'm curious, do you think that Europe even has the framework to resist this kind of thing? Well, let's answer that one, and then I have another one about the motivations of these migrants. But do you think Europe has the the cojones, the ability to stand on its own 2 feet and say no? Because you kind of see some of that in France. You see some leaders talking about it, but I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I think Eastern Europe does. Nations like Hungary and Poland, even though Poland's kind of going in the wrong direction again, it's like the West. But Western Europe, I think it may very well be too late. You have to understand that there's also a demographic jihad going on. That's how a lot of Muslim clerics articulate it. And if you look at all the large major capitals of Western Europe, Oslo in Norway, Amsterdam, I think, well, not Copenhagen, Brussels, I believe Vienna, lots of them, the number one name of newborn baby boys is Muhammad. Okay, that's very telling. And your average Muslim woman living in Europe has many more children than the average native European woman does. So in those, and again, not only do they have these large numbers, but those populations, much like in America, but even more so, have been really emasculated into not being able to do anything about it, to accepting it, and if they don't, they're racist and there's xenophobes, et cetera, et cetera. And apparently it does work. It paralyzes a lot of them. And, it's even gotten worse to the point that when they do rise up, the native Europeans, such as in Dublin recently, when a Muslim man just went stabbing randomly and stabbed three children, age 5 or so, I think nearly killed a girl, a little child, as well as their caretaker. And the Irish in Dublin rose in violence and protest because this was not the first time. And, it's an axiomatic rule. The more migrants you bring in, the more criminality comes with them. And they wanted to stop to it. So their prime minister, who I didn't even know this, isn't Irish. She's actually Indian, or at least half Indian, responded by calling them haters and xenophobes and I think ushering in some new censorship law. So now you can't even criticize what's happening and then you'll be a criminal. So I think the only way for Western Europe to actually recover will have to be an actual, I believe, insurrection and a toppling of the current order, which I don't think your average Western European male has, as you put it, the cojones to do.
Right. With the motivations, this is one thing I encounter as a pastor. Because when you talk about biblical principles in the Bible, whether it's Israel welcoming sojourners and strangers or New Testament and how we're supposed to go disciple the nations, a lot of the rhetoric in evangelicalism, when you talk about these issues, is like, one, you can't know why they're coming across the border, and two, we should welcome everyone. And so when you talk about it in a strong way, it's very upsetting and off-putting. And so I was wondering if you could provide maybe some background on like motivations to like particularly in Europe, for example, since you're writing about Islam particularly. What are the motivations for this? Because the Crusaders in the past, they were resisting more openly, like these leaders, these rulers that were openly, declaring war on the West, that were openly attacking. And now it seems more subtle. So I'm wondering if you have any information or you could provide a perspective that might shed some light on like this migrant crisis, why they're coming. Because I think most people see it as they're like, well, they just want a better life. Why don't you want them to have a better life? How does maybe your study of Islam challenge that narrative?
Well, as far as the better life thing, I mean, I don't discount that. I believe a lot of people want to come to the West for a better life or to oftentimes escape persecution. My family came from Egypt. I was born here, but my parents migrated here, but they did it legally. I don't know. They told me the story, but it took years, for all that to even happen. And they assimilated, and that's the good thing. But I think your main question as to why Western leadership is even allowing this and what they're doing. One of my suspicions is the enemy is my friend, and the elites of Europe hate Europe's heritage, its Christian heritage, and they want to see it gone one way or the other, whether it's through secularization or whether it's by inundating these nations with with the historical enemy of Christianity. All throughout Europe right now, wherever you have Muslim migrants, you have continuous nonstop attacks and desecrations of churches daily. This last Christmas, I don't know how many dozen different reports I read of nativity scenes having, Joseph and Mary and Jesus' head, baby Jesus' head decapitated,
Hmm.
burned, broken, smashed, dozens all throughout. These are the ones that were reported. Okay, and you know who's doing it. It's obvious. And so I think on the one hand, it's another way of sort of persecuting Christians in their own country by bringing their historic persecutor into their countries to prey on them and on their way of life. That's definitely, I think, one of it. And another thing is, this theory of I don't know how it's called, the great population switch or shift, which is called a conspiracy. It's not a conspiracy. They're trying to obviously outbreed the natives. It's amazing because if you look at the white population, and I'll say that word because a lot of people can say white and black. If you look at the white population of the world, I think it's 5%. And it's amazing, and white people in Europe and America, when they see minorities coming in, they don't think of it that way because they think of their nations, and their nations are still majority European or white or whatever. But in the big picture, they're the tiny minority, and yet they're the only demographic who are continuously called on to accept other nations and suppress their own heritage to accommodate for these essentially invaders. It's really amazing. I mean, you talk about beyond suicidal. The
Yeah.
smallest demographic is the one that is, being cowed into becoming even smaller and less,
Yeah.
having less of an identity. So obviously that is intentional.
Yeah. It's interesting when you look at even sociological data on in-group favoritism amongst certain groups, where the one group that like hates itself the most is white people, and
Yeah.
like everyone else is very favorable towards their own people.
Mhm.
It just
But
seems
that's but
very,
that's by design. That's by design. That's generations and generations of indoctrination from Hollywood, from academia, from everything has intentionally crafted the newer generations or the current generations of white people to hate themselves. And this goes back to the Crusades. That's something we never say we do a crusade. That's horrible. That's evil. Crusaders are monsters. And yet, if you go to the true story, no, they're not. They were defenders. They were heroes. So it has to do with this continuous bombardment of the Western psyche into just hating their heritage and trying to disassociate themselves from it.
yeah.
And
So
it's worked.
yeah, and it can be really depressing. So if a listener's listening to this episode, right now I'm feeling kind of like, well, what hope? And of course, as a pastor, I point people to Christ and the hope that we have in Him, that He is Lord of Lords, King of Kings. All the nations belong to Him. But what would you say might be a way forward, or what signs of hope do you see today?
I mean, the way forward is to just we can't rely on the government anymore or the powers that be. They're just corrupt. They're the way they are. They're not going to change, and it's not going to be about voting this person in or that person out. Trump is one man. Whatever he can do, good. But we always have this phenomenon where something good happens and we get one good guy, and then it's like a step forward and two steps back. What's going to happen after Trump, for example? Let's say he wins. 4 years later, then what? We're going to have Biden, 2.0 for 8 years, and so I think the system is fundamentally flawed, and people don't want to hear it. But I think one of the tricks is to paralyze Western people into thinking that someone else is going to take care of it. All I have to
Yeah,
do is maybe vote or voice my opinion. But history shows that change only happens through actual revolution, and it happens, bottom up, essentially. The Revolutionary War, the founding fathers, who were once heroes, of course, they're also demonized. What did they do? They went to war when they found that the system wasn't working, it was unjust towards them. But what did they do? I mean, they didn't just say, "Okay, I'm just going to wait until another English king comes and maybe he'll be better." They
sure.
took matters into their own hands. I know people don't want to hear that, but historically, that's what it takes to make change.
Yeah, and as a pastor, I think, you know, my heart is that for a lot of people in the West, this is a unique opportunity where a lot of things are being exposed. I mean, the last 4 years kind of put a lot of stuff kind of out there. And I think there's a huge population, at least in our country, that, as Jesus would call it, the fields are ripe for the harvest. Like there's a huge opportunity, and cultures change. and they're informed by Christ and his church. And so we need strong churches, strong families, and strong communities. And I think there's great opportunity, but it's going to take us being willing to talk about these things, being willing to be honest about these things, a sober assessment of where we're at so that we can move forward. If we keep living in denial and believing these lies about what the Bible teaches and about our own history and heritage, then of course it will continue to decline. But we can have great hope in Christ through his church as we see more churches that are standing strong, resisting government tyranny, and equipping their people to think biblically on these matters and not butchering Jesus' teaching and butchering history in order to accommodate and placate kind of these secular elites. I think that there's great opportunity today. So thank you for coming on the pod today. I really enjoyed the book. Thank you for writing the book. Where can people pick it up and learn more about you, Raymond?
My website, RaymondIbrahim.com, RaymondiBrahin, has my bio, has my articles, and also has links to my books, mostly to Amazon, but you can find them elsewhere. And you can subscribe to it, and you can even contact me on my website.
Perfect. And I'll put a link to your Twitter bio in there, and people can follow you on there. But thank you so much for spending time with me today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.